Imagine 187 men trapped inside a crumbling mission in the unforgiving Texas frontier, surrounded by an army of over 1,800 soldiers. No reinforcements, no escape, no mercy. This is the story of the Battle of the Alamo, a moment so dangerous, so brutal, so impossible, that it became a legend whispered across the Wild West for generations. In San Antonio, there's a stone church people treat like a shrine, but in 1836, it became a cage. 13 days, a shrinking circle of defenders, and an ending so brutal it turned into a battle cry. At first it was not built for war. It began as a mission. It was a religious place meant for prayer and work. But time changes buildings, the way time changes people. The mission became a strong point. It had thick walls, it had rooms, it had open spaces where men could stand with guns. It was not perfect, but it was something that could be held if. Help came soon. In early 1836, Texas was in the middle of a fight that would shape its future. This fight is known as the Texas Revolution. On one side was the Mexican government, an army. On the other side were Texian rebels and supporters, including many people who lived in Texas and wanted a different future. The reasons were complex, but the result was clear. The land was boiling with tension, and the next spark could light everything. That spark moved toward San Antonio with boots, horses, flags, and cannon. His name was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Santa Anna was not just a general. He was also the president of Mexico. He carried power like a blade. He believed the rebellion must be crushed fast. He believed fear could end the problem. If he took the strongest places and punished those who resisted, he could break the spirit of the revolt. So he marched north. As Santa Anna's forces entered San Antonio, the city changed. Streets that were normal 1 week became dangerous next. People watched from windows, doors shut, the air felt tight. Word spread quickly. The Mexican army was here, and it was large. Inside the Alamo, a smaller group prepared to face the storm. Their leader was a young officer named William Barrett Travis. He was sharp, proud, and determined. He believed that if the Alamo fell without a fight, it would send a message of weakness. But if it held, even for a short time, it could buy time for the revolution. Another important man inside was James Bowie. He was famous, tough, and stubborn. Many people knew his name before the siege even began. He was not the kind of man who backed away easily. Some admired him, some feared him, but in that moment, what mattered most was that he was there. And then there was Davy Crockett. Crockett was already a legend while he was still alive. He was a frontiersman, a storyteller, a man people talked about like a character from a book. He had left his old life behind and traveled to Texas. His presence at the Alamo would become part of the larger myth later, but in the beginning, he was simply one of the men who had to decide what to do next. The Alamo did not feel like a legend at that moment. It felt like a cornered place. The defenders looked at the walls and measured them with their eyes. They counted guns, they counted cannon, they counted food, they counted time. Time was the one thing they could not replace. They knew Santa Anna's army had more men. They knew his cannons could pound the walls again and again. They knew the siege would tighten like a rope. Yet they stayed. Some stayed because they believed in Texas. Some stayed because pride held them in place. Some stayed because leaving felt worse than dying. Some stayed because they hoped help would arrive before the final blow. And some stayed because once the army surrounded the fort, leaving was no longer simple. On February 23, 1836, the siege began. Santa Anna's troops moved into position. They placed guards. They cut off paths. They made it clear. The Alamo was now a prison made of stone and fear. The defenders could see the movement outside. They could hear the sounds. They could feel the weight of thousands of eyes watching. The men inside waited for the first hard moment. It came quickly. Cannons began to speak. The sound was not like a gun. It was deeper, heavier, more cruel. A cannon did not just kill a man. It broke walls. It shook the ground. It turned safe corners into death traps. Each blast reminded the defenders of one simple truth. This was not a fair fight, but the defenders did not run. They returned fire. They repaired damage as best they could. They moved supplies. They took turns watching the dark. They tried to sleep, but sleep did not come easily. Every night felt longer than the last. Every dawn felt like a question. Would the walls still stand by nightfall? Inside those walls, fear was not a single moment. It was constant. It lived in empty stomachs, sore hands, and tired eyes. It lived in the quiet after a cannon shot, when everyone wondered who would not stand up again. Still, something else lived there to dot resolve. It is easy to say men become brave in war. But bravery is not a magical change. It is often just a choice made again and again, even while hands shake. Many of the men inside the Alamo were afraid. The difference was that they did not let fear make the decision for them. The Alamo, as a place, had its own biography. It had been a mission, then a military post, and now a symbol. But symbols are not born from speeches. They are born from pressure. They are born when people are forced to stand for something, even when the cost is high. And the cost was rising. Outside, Santa Anna waited and watched. He believed time was on his side. He believed the walls would crack, the men would break, and the story would end quickly. Inside, Travis, Davy Crockett, and the others looked at one another and understood something without saying it out loud. This was only the beginning. The next day inside the Alamo did not feel like a new day. It felt like the same fear wearing a different mask. The men woke up tired, even if they barely slept. Their bodies were inside the walls, but their minds were already outside counting the enemy, listening for cannon, watching for movement. Outside the fort, Santa Anna's army kept growing more organized. Tents appeared. Fires burned through the night. Soldiers moved like a machine. Guards stood where escape routes used to be. The message was clear. The Alamo was surrounded, and the circle was not going to open. Inside the Alamo, William Barrett. Travis tried to make order out of stress. He was young, but he carried himself like he could hold the whole fort on his shoulders. He walked the walls. He checked the guns. He spoke to men who looked at him with tired eyes, men who needed hope more than they needed food. James Bowie, who had been strong and bold, was not at his best. His health began to fail. Some days he could still speak with fire, and other days he seemed trapped inside his own body. The Alamo did not only fight the Mexican army, it also fought sickness, cold nights, and exhaustion. Davy Crockett stayed close to the men, using humor when he could. He understood something important. Fear grows faster in silence. So he gave people a reason to breathe, even for a moment. Sometimes that is what keeps a person standing. But every laugh ended the same way: back to work, back to the walls, back to listening. The cannons did not stop. Day after day, the Mexican artillery fired at the compound. The Alamo answered back when it could, but the defenders had fewer supplies and fewer men. Each cannon shot was like a reminder carved into stone. Time was not friendly. The defenders repaired what they could. They filled gaps. They moved guns to stronger positions. They worked like men who knew they might never see the outside world. Again, dot and still, they waited for help. Help was not just a nice idea. It was the difference between survival and disaster. The Alamo could not hold forever. Everyone inside knew it, even when they did not say it aloud. Travis understood this better than anyone. So he wrote letters, urgent, emotional calls for support. He sent messengers through the enemy lines, hoping someone could slip out in the dark and carry his words to nearby forces. Those messengers had to ride through danger. They had to move quietly, avoid patrols, and trust the night. Some did make it out, some did not. The siege was not only about cannons, it was also about information. Whoever controlled the flow of news controlled hope. Inside the Alamo, hope became thin and precious. The defenders began to count everything, not just food, not just bullets. They counted usable blankets. They counted working tools. They counted men who could still stand. A fort does not fall only when walls break. It falls when people stop believing they can hold it. So Travis tried to keep belief alive. He spoke like a man who was convincing himself as much as he was convincing others. He told them their stand mattered. He told them their time was buying time for Texas. He told them they were not alone even when, deep inside, he feared they were. The days passed slowly. Some men argued. That is normal in a pressure cooker. There were questions about command, questions about plans, questions about what to do if the enemy broke through. When fear is constant, even small disagreements can feel sharp. But the enemy outside helped unite them. Because every time the cannon fired, every time the enemy line moved closer, the arguments became less important. Survival has a way of making priorities clear. At night, the Alamo felt colder. Darkness hides details, and that makes the mind imagine worse ones. A guard would stare into the black and think he saw movement. A shadow would look like a soldier. A distant sound would feel like an attack. Sometimes the Mexican troops played music. Sometimes they called out. Sometimes they made noise on purpose. It was another kind of weapon, one that aimed at nerves instead of flesh. Inside, men tried to rest in short pieces. Sleep came in broken sections, like a damaged rope. A man would close his eyes for a few minutes, then wake at the sound of a cannon or the shout of a lookout. In the middle of this, there were also non-fighters in and around the compound, women and children who had taken shelter. Their presence added another weight. It is one thing to accept danger for yourself. It is another thing to hear a child crying in the dark while you hold a rifle. The defenders knew the battle would not only decide their lives, it could decide the lives of others too. As the siege continued, the Mexican army strengthened its positions. The defenders began to notice changes: more activity, tighter discipline, more soldiers moving with purpose. That usually meant something. It meant Santa Anna was not planning to wait forever. The Alamo's walls showed damage. Small cracks and broken areas appeared. The defenders patched them quickly, but the truth could not be hidden. The fort was being worn down, and inside the Alamo, sickness and fatigue were also wearing men down. Still, the defenders kept firing. They kept watching. They kept believing, because belief was the last thing they fully controlled. There is a moment in every true story where the heroes realize something painful. The world may not reward courage. It may not send help just because help is needed. The Alamo reached that moment slowly. Each day without reinforcements felt like a door closing. Each night felt like the enemy was breathing closer. The defenders did not panic all at once. Panic came in waves, first in one man, then in another, then in a quiet room where someone whispered, "What if nobody comes?" Travis did not stop trying. He did not stop sending messages. He did not stop acting like help was on the way, because if he stopped, the fort would collapse from the inside. And then as the days reached deeper into the siege, something changed. In the air, the enemy seemed ready. The defenders sensed it, not because they had a clear signal, but because fear has instincts. The Alamo felt like a candle burning lower. The light was still there, but the wax was running out. The men on the wall looked at the horizon and wondered if they would see friends or foes coming through the dust. The dust did rise, but it did not bring comfort. The Alamo woke up to the same truth again. The siege was not ending. The Mexican cannons kept firing, and every blast felt like a heavy hand hitting stone. Dust fell from cracks. Men flinched without meaning to. Even the bravest could not ignore the sound forever. Inside the compound, time moved in a strange way. Some hours felt slow, like a long walk through deep mud. Other moments moved too fast, like a sudden shout that turned into a fight. The defenders lived between these two speeds, waiting, then reacting, then waiting again. William Barrett Travis could see the change in the men's faces. They were still standing, but the worry was getting deeper. He knew that courage needed support. Without help, courage starts to feel like a lie. People tell themselves to stay alive, so Travis did what leaders often do when they cannot win with bullets. He tried to win with words. Travis sat down and wrote a message meant for the outside world. It was not polite. It was not calm. It was a desperate call. He told people what was happening. He told them the Alamo was surrounded. He asked for men, supplies, and support. He wrote as if every word had to move a person's heart, because that was the only weapon left that could travel past the enemy lines. When the letter was finished, it was like a piece of his soul placed on paper. He needed it to reach someone, anyone who could turn hope into action. But a letter is only as strong as the person carrying it. A messenger prepared to ride through danger. He could not take a straight road. He could not move loudly. He had to trust darkness, speed, and luck. The enemy had patrols. They had eyes. They had rifles. One wrong turn could mean capture or worse. Inside the Alamo, the men watched the rider disappear into the night. Some prayed quietly. Others said nothing. They just stared, as if their eyes could protect him. When the gate closed again, the compound felt even smaller. Days passed. The cannons kept pounding. The defenders returned fire when they could, but they could not waste ammunition. Every shot had to matter. Every bullet was counted. Every bag of powder was watched out in the middle of the siege. James Bowie grew weaker. At first, he had been a strong presence, stubborn, hard to shake. But sickness does not care about pride. Bowie's body began to fail him. He spent more time lying down, his face pale, his breathing heavy. Some men tried not to look worried, but they were. If a famous, tough man could be brought down so quickly, what could happen to anyone? Bowie's illness changed the feeling inside the walls. It reminded everyone that the enemy was not only outside, there was also weakness, fatigue, and disease creeping inside. Davy Crockett stayed close to the men. He kept talking, kept moving, kept helping wherever he could. He understood that fear grows in empty space. So he filled that space with human sounds, small jokes, steady words, a calm tone. But even Crockett could not joke away hunger. He could not laugh away the cold nights, and he could not talk loud enough to cover the sound of the cannons. The defenders repaired damage with whatever they had. They used wood, dirt, scraps of metal. They built barriers inside the compound, preparing for the worst. If the enemy broke through the outer defense, the fight would move into tighter spaces. Hallways, rooms, corners, places where a man could not easily run. Travis walked the lines again and again. He spoke to the men directly. He looked them in the eyes. A leader's voice is not magic, but it can steady shaking hands. He reminded them why they were there. He reminded them that holding the Alamo was buying time for Texas. And he reminded them, softly, that leaving now might not even be possible. Somewhere inside the compound, a quiet thought grew louder each day. What if no? One comes. The men did not say it to Travis often, but it was in their faces. It was in the way they looked toward the horizon. It was in the way they listened, hoping to hear friendly footsteps instead of enemy drums. Then, one night, something different happened. A guard saw movement in the dark, not the steady movement of enemy patrols. This was fast, careful, like men, trying to approach without being seen. The defenders stiffened. Cans went to rifles. Someone whispered a warning. For a moment, it felt like the final attack had started. But then a voice called out low and urgent. Not Spanish, not enemy.friends.a. Small group of reinforcements slipped into the Alamo under cover of darkness. They came from Gonzales. They were not a huge army. They were not enough to end the siege. But they were real men with real guns, and they chose to come anyway. Inside the compound, the mood changed instantly. Tired faces lifted, men shook hands, some hugged quickly, like they were afraid to waste time. For a moment, it felt like the world outside still cared. The new arrivals looked around and understood what the defenders had been living through. The walls were damaged, supplies were tight, the air smelled like smoke and sweat. But the defenders were still standing. Those reinforcements did not bring victory, but they brought proof. Proof that courage could travel. Proof that the Alamo had not been forgotten. Yet hope, in a siege, can also be dangerous, because when hope rises, the fall is harder. The defenders now had more men, but they also had more mouths to feed. Food did not grow on stone. Ammunition did not appear by wishing. The enemy outside was still larger. The cannons still fired. The circle still stayed closed, and Santa Anna, watching from outside, did not look like a man losing patience. He looked like a man preparing to finish the job. Inside the Alamo, the leaders faced a hard question. Should they try to break out? Some men believed a breakout could save lives. Others believed leaving would destroy the meaning of the stand. Some believed they owed it to Texas to hold a position. Others believed they owed it to themselves to survive. There was no easy answer. Only risk. Only pressure. Only time sliding away. The Alamo's story was becoming more than a fight. It was becoming a test of human choice under fear. Outside, the enemy prepared. Inside, men checked their weapons, tightened their belts, and tried to pretend their hands were not shaking. The siege had entered a new stage now. Not the stage of waiting, the stage of nearing. By now, the Alamo did not feel like a fort. It felt like a living thing that was getting tired. The walls were still standing, but they carried scars. The ground inside was packed with footprints. The air smelled like smoke, sweat, and old fear. Outside the walls, Santa Anna's army stayed. Strong. The camp looked steady and confident. Fires burned in neat lines. Guards changed shifts like a routine. The Mexican cannons still fired, not always to destroy, but to remind the defenders that the enemy controlled the time. Inside the Alamo, time was the enemy. Men moved with a quiet urgency. They did not waste steps. They did not waste words. They saved energy like it was food. William Barrett Travis kept watching the horizon. He kept sending messages when he could, but he also knew something painful. Even if help was coming, it might come too late. He could not say that to the men. Not clearly, not out loud. A leader's job is not only to plan, it is also to hold the spirit together when the facts are heavy. As the siege tightened, the hardest battle inside the Alamo was not the cannon fire. It was the argument about what to do next. Some defenders believed they should try to break out. They believed staying inside meant certain death. They believed a fast escape in the night could save lives. They could move in small groups, slip through weak points, and reach friendly forces. Elsewhere, other defenders believed leaving was wrong. They believed that the Alamo had become more than a building. It had become a signal to the world. If they ran, the signal would die. If they held, even if they died, their stand could still help Texas. The arguments were not simple. They were not about bravery versus cowardice. They were about survival versus duty. A man can be brave and still want to live. A man can be brave and still feel fear. Fear was everywhere. Travis listened to these voices. He did not dismiss them. He understood the logic of escape, but he also saw the reality. The enemy lines were tight. Patrols moved through the dark. Horses waited. Rifles waited. A breakout could turn into a slaughter in open ground. And then there were the people who were not soldiers. Women and children had taken shelter inside the compound. Some were family members of the defenders. Some were local civilians caught in the danger. They could not run fast. They could not fight like the men. Their safety made every decision heavier. If the defenders tried to escape, what would happen to those who could not? The Alamo was not just holding fighters, it was holding lives. James Bowie, weakened by sickness, could not walk the walls like before, but his presence still mattered. Even lying down, he was a symbol of stubbornness. He had the look of a man who would not surrender. Even when his body was failing him, Davy Crockett stayed among the men, watching their faces, reading the room. He understood crowds. He understood fear. He knew that a group can break before the walls break. He spoke to men who sat too quietly. He put a hand on shoulders. He reminded them they were not alone inside those walls. But the truth was still there. The Alamo was surrounded. Food was limited. Ammunition could not last forever. And Santa Anna was not leaving. At some point during the siege, Santa Anna signaled that he wanted no surrender, no mercy for armed rebels. Different accounts described these signals and moments in different ways, but the meaning was understood inside the walls. The enemy wanted this to end with complete control. The defenders did not need perfect information to feel the threat. They felt it every time a cannon hit. They felt it in every long night. They felt it in the way the enemy camp seemed come as if the outcome was already decided inside the Alamo. The women tried to keep children calm. They used soft voices. They used small songs. They tried to create normal life in a place that was no longer normal. Children do not understand politics. They understand sound, hunger, and fear. They understand when adults are scared. Some of the men avoided looking at them because it made the situation surreal. It is one thing to accept death as a soldier. It is another thing to accept it while hearing a child breathe in the dark. Travis walked to different positions and spoke to different groups. He did not beg. He did not shout. He spoke with seriousness. He made sure the men knew what he believed, that the Alamo should be held as long as possible. Later stories, told many years afterward, say Travis offered the men a clear choice to stay or leave. Some versions describe a dramatic moment. History does not agree on every detail, and not every story can be proven. But one truth remains. The defenders did make a choice, and many chose to stay, not because they were sure they would win, because they believed their stand mattered. As night approached, the Alamo became quieter in a strange way. The cannon still fired, but the defenders began to notice patterns. The enemy seemed to be preparing. Movement outside looked more purposeful, more focused. This kind of preparation is something soldiers learn to recognize. When an army stops, testing and starts arranging, it usually means an attack is close, inside. The defenders made their own preparations. They moved supplies to safer spots. They placed extra ammunition where it could be reached fast. They set small barriers inside the compound, so if the outer defense fell, they could still fight from room to room. They also prepared their minds. Some men prayed. Some wrote quick notes. Some stared at the walls as if trying to memorize them. Some sat in silence, because words felt too small. The night air grew colder. The sky grew darker. The enemy fires outside looked like a ring of red eyes. Travis stood where he could see over the wall. He did not look away. He had the face of a man who knew the cost but refused to bend. Crockett checked his rifle and watched the men around him. He could feel how close the moment was. It was not a guess anymore. It was in the air. Bowie lay still, fighting sickness, fighting weakness, fighting the slow pull of the body, and the others farmers, hunters, volunteers, locals waited with the heavy knowledge that history was about to step into the room. The Alamo's story was no longer about if, it was about when. And somewhere outside, in the dark, the enemy prepared to move at first light. The night before the final attack did not feel like a normal night. It felt heavier, like the air itself knew what was coming. Inside the Alamo, men moved more quietly than usual. Not because they were calm, but because too much noise felt pointless now. Outside the walls, the Mexican camp was alive. Fires flickered, shadows passed back and forth, boots pressed into the ground in steady lines. The defenders could not see every detail, but they could feel the change. An army does not prepare in silence for no reason. The siege had lasted many days. The Alamo had been tested again and again. The walls were damaged. Supplies were low. Sleep was broken. Every man inside carried a private fear, even if he never said it out loud. But on this night, that fear became clearer, because waiting has a limit, and the limit felt close. Gart watched the enemy camp and tried to read it like a book. He noticed movement that looked planned, not random. He noticed groups gathering, then stopping. He noticed how the camp seemed too ready, too focused. Inside the compound, William Barrett Travis kept walking. He checked positions. He spoke in low tones. He looked at the men like he was trying to memorize their faces. He was not only leading them, he was carrying the weight of what might happen to them. Travis did not pretend everything was fine. That kind of lie would break people. Instead, he gave them something stronger than comfort. He gave them purpose. He reminded them that their stand mattered. He reminded them that every hour they held, the Alamo was time gained for the wider fight. He reminded them, in the simplest way, that they were not fighting for stone walls. They were fighting for what those walls now represented. James Bowie was weaker now. His sickness had taken away his strength and his movement. He could not stand on the wall with the others. He could not run if things went wrong, but he was still there, even lying down. Bowie was part of the story the defenders told themselves, that a man could be broken physically and still refuse to surrender. Some men checked on him quietly. They did not talk much. What could they say? Words felt too small beside what was happening. Davy Crockett moved through the Alamo with a different kind of leadership. He watched the mood. He watched the fear rising and tried to stop it from turning into panic. He spoke to one man, then another. He made a short comment that pulled a tired laugh. Not a joyful laugh. Not a joyful laugh. More like a breath that helped someone stay. Steady on the surface, Crockett looked calmed out inside. He was doing the same math as everyone else. How long can these walls hold? How long can men hold? Ammunition was handled like gold. Powder was measured. Bullets were stacked where they could be. Reached fast. Some men cleaned their weapons again, even though they had already cleaned them. It was not because the guns needed it. It was because hands need something to do when fear is too big. In a corner of the compound, a few men wrote short messages. Some wrote to wives. Some wrote to parents. Some wrote to nobody in particular, just words on paper, as if writing could hold a piece of them. If the morning took the rest, not every man wrote. Some stared into the dark, some prayed, some sat quietly, with their backs against the stone, feeling the cold seep into them. Nearby, women tried to keep children calm. They made small beds. They held little hands. They used soft voices. They tried to make the night feel safe when it was not. A child does not understand strategy. A child understands tone. A child understands when adults are scared, and adults were scared. Even the strongest men could not fully hide it. That is what made the Alamo so human. It was not a story of fearless people. It was a story of people who felt fear and stayed anyway. Outside, Santa Anna's soldiers prepared for an assault. They had more men, more supplies, and more control of the field. The defenders inside the Alamo could not match that. They could only choose how to meet it. For the defenders, the night became a slow countdown. Every time a cannon fired, it felt like the enemy tapping a clock. Every time a shout came from outside, it felt like the enemy testing nerves. Every time the wind shifted, it carried sounds from the camp metal footsteps. Murmurs. All of it said the same thing. It is coming, Travis. Looked over the walls and thought about reinforcements. He thought about the people who promised help. He thought about how far away they might be. He thought about how war does not always give people enough time to keep promises. He did not show despair. He could not afford to. He was the kind of man who understood that even if the outcome was dark, the way you face it can light a path for others later. That is what leadership can be. Not winning, but holding the line of spirit until the last possible moment. Crockett looked at the sky, then back at the men. He saw the same thought on many faces. If this is the last night, then let it at least mean something. The Alamo, as a place, had become a stage where ordinary men were forced into an extraordinary moment. And no one had control over how the world would tell the story later. They only had control over what they did when morning came. Then, somewhere near the darkest part of the night, the enemy movement changed again. The defenders on watch stiffened. A shadow line shifted where it had been still. Unseen by most, seemed to pass through the Mexican camp. Inside the Alamo, men rose quietly from their positions. They listened harder. They gripped their weapons tighter. They took their places, as if their bodies moved on instinct. No one shouted. No one needed to. The fear was sharp now. Like cold metal, the sky began to lighten slightly. Just a hint, like the world turning its face toward dawn. And dawn was not just sunrise. Dawn was decision. Dawn was impact. Dawn was the moment the siege would stop being a slow squeeze and become something fast and final. Inside the Alamo, the defenders waited in a tense silence. Outside, the attackers prepared to move. And the biography of the Alamo reached the edge of its most famous page. The night did not end with peace. It ended with movement. Inside the Alamo, the defenders were already awake. Some had never truly slept. They stood in their positions, watching the walls, watching the open ground outside, waiting for the moment they felt in their bones. Outside the compound, Santa Anna's army prepared in the dark. Soldiers gathered quietly in groups. Officers gave signals in low voices. Boots shifted on dirt. Steel clicked softly. The men outside did not need to shout. They had numbers. They had orders. They had been waiting for this moment. Then the stillness broke. The attack came at dawn. When the light was weak and the sky was changing color, the enemy moved forward in columns, rushing toward the walls. The defenders saw them coming and fired. The first shots cracked through the air like snapping wood. Smoke rose. Men yelled. The quiet of the night disappeared in a heartbeat. Inside the Alamo, the defenders fought like men who had no space left to lose. They fired from the walls. They fired from windows. They fired from behind rough barriers made from wood and stone. Each shot mattered. Each reload felt slower than it should have, because fear makes hands feel heavy. The attackers kept coming. The Mexican soldiers reached the walls and tried to climb. Some fell, others took their place. Ladders rose. Hands grabbed stone. Boots scraped. The defenders pushed ladders away when they could. They struck down at hands and heads. They did whatever they could to stop the climb. But the attack did not stop. It came again and again. Like waves hitting the same rock. William Barrett Travis moved along the defense line, trying to keep men steady. He shouted commands. He pointed where to fire. He tried to hold the shape of the defense as it bent under pressure. In a battle like this, order is fragile. Smoke hides shapes. Noise confuses directions. A man can miss a call, miss a step, miss a second, and a second can decide everything. The attackers reached the top of the walls in places. The defenders fought them back. Then the attackers reached again. A crack in the defense line is all an army needs. Inside the Alamo, the defenders began to understand the truth of the morning. This was not a test. This was the end. When the attackers broke into parts of the compound, the fight changed. It became closer, harder, faster. A wall is one thing. A courtyard is another. Now there were men running through open space, men shouting for others to fall back, men reloading too late, men firing too soon. The battle turned into sharp, confused moments, like lightning strikes in smoke. Some defenders fell back to stronger positions inside the compound. They moved toward buildings. They used corners. They used doorways. They tried to force the attackers into narrow places where numbers would not matter as much, but numbers still mattered. The attackers kept pouring in, and the Alamo began to collapse from the outside toward the center. James Bowie was too sick to fight on the walls. He could not stand with the others. He could not run to the next position. The battle came to him instead. The sound of fighting moved closer. Shouts became louder. Footsteps hit floors. Smoke entered rooms. In that moment, Bowie's world became small, just a bed, a weapon, a breath, and the knowledge that the enemy was inside. The siege had been a long pressure. The assault was a sudden storm, and now, inside the Alamo, the storm was everywhere. Davy Crockett fought with the men near him, in the chaos that comes when defense turns into survival. Later, people would argue about details of his last moments. History does not agree on every single part of that story, but it does agree on the big truth. He was there, and he did not walk away around him. The defenders were not thinking about legend. They were thinking about the next second. They were thinking about staying alive for one more breath, one more shot, one more step. Many of the men inside were ordinary people, farmers, workers, volunteers, now forced into a fight that felt larger than life. And yet, their fear was normal. Their pain was normal. Their courage was normal. Too, because courage is often just a person refusing to quit. Even while everything screams to quit, the fighting moved into the last strong points. Buildings that had offered shelter now became final defenses. The defenders shot through doorways. They pushed back attackers in tight spaces. They tried to hold rooms the way they had held walls. But the attackers were too many, and the defenders were running out of everything. Out of ammunition, out of strength, out of time. In battles like this, the ending is not one clean moment. It is a series of losses that happen faster and faster until there is no line left to hold. The Alamo reached that point as the sun climbed. The fighting began to fade, not because peace arrived, but because the defenders were being overwhelmed. One by one, their positions fell. One by one, their voices went quiet. When the battle ended, the Alamo was no longer a fort holding out. It was a captured place. The defenders, almost all of them, were gone, and inside the compound. The survivors, who were not fighters, women and children, were left to face the silence after violence. That silence is a special kind of sound. It is not calm. It is shock. It is the world trying to understand what it just saw. Outside the walls, the attackers had won the ground, but they could not erase what the defenders had created, because a battle does not only live in its outcome, it lives in what people carry forward after it. And the fall of the Alamo, in a strange way, was not the end of its power. It was the beginning of its story as a symbol. A small group stood against a much larger force. They held as long as they could. They did not survive, but their stand did. That is why people still say the words. Not because the Alamo was perfect, not because every decision was right, but because human beings can see themselves in a moment like that, when fear closes in and people still choose to stand. When the fighting stopped, the Alamo did not feel like a victory ground. It felt like a place that had been emptied of sound. The air was thick with smoke and dust. The stone walls still stood, but they looked different, now marked, broken and silent. Inside the compound, bodies lay where men had fallen. Weapons were scattered. Barriers that had helped defend the fort were smashed or pushed aside. The last morning had been loud and fast. The minutes after it were slow and heavy. Outside the walls, the Mexican army controlled San Antonio. Santa Anna had won the fort. But winning a fort and winning a war are not the same thing. The survivors inside the Alamo were mostly people who did not fight: women, children, and a few others who had been sheltered during the siege. They stepped carefully through the aftermath. They looked for familiar faces, and then they stopped looking, because the truth was too clear. They had lived through the siege. By holding on to the idea that the worst might not happen, now the worst had happened. A child might not understand why men fight, but a child understands loss. The silence after violence can feel like the whole world has changed. The women tried to keep the children close. They tried to move them away from the worst sights. They tried to speak softly, as if calm words could rebuild what had been destroyed. But calm is hard to find when a place still smells like smoke. Santa Anna's soldiers moved through the compound, collecting weapons and taking control of every corner. They checked rooms. They searched positions. They confirmed that the fort was fully taken. Some accounts describe harsh treatment for any defenders who survived the battle as fighters. History does not agree on every single detail, but the broader message of Santa Anna's approach was understood across Texas. He wanted the rebellion to fear him. He wanted resistance to feel expensive. That was part of his strategy. Fear can be a weapon. Santa Anna's goal was not only to win the Alamo, it was to send a signal to every town, every rebel leader, every volunteer thinking about joining the fight. This is what happens when you resist. So the victory had to be seen. It had to be felt. The Alamo had to become a warning. The dead were not treated like honored soldiers. They were treated like a problem to be cleared. In the days after the battle, the remains of the defenders were gathered and burned. That detail was hard to picture from modern eyes, but it was part of the reality of war. In that time, especially in a moment meant to punish and intimidate. Fire rose into the air. Smoke carried the end of the Alamo across the city, and the survivors who watched that smoke understood something new. The story would not end inside these walls. News travels fast when it is carried by fear and grief. Word began to spread outward through riders, through whispers, through people escaping danger. The message moved along roads and across rivers. It moved into settlements and camps and small communities where families waited for updates. The Alamo has fallen. Sometimes a sentence is short, but it changes everything. People who heard the news reacted in different ways. Some were shocked, some were angry, some were terrified. Some were not surprised, because they had feared this ending for days. But almost everyone understood the same thing. If Santa Anna could take the Alamo, he could keep moving. For the Texian cause, the fall of the Alamo was painful. It was a loss in men, a loss in supplies, and a loss of a key position. There was no way to pretend it was good news. Yet something strange began to happen. Instead of ending the rebellion, the Alamo began to harden it. People often think a cause grows only from victories, but causes can also grow from sacrifice. A defeat can become a fire if enough people decide the loss must mean something. The names inside the Alamo: Travis, Bowie, Crockett, and the many others began to turn into symbols. Not because they were perfect men, not because every choice was correct, but because they stood in a moment when standing looked impossible. And that kind of stand can grip the human heart. Soon, a phrase began to move with the news. Remember the Alamo. Those words did not bring the dead back. They did not rebuild the walls, but they did something else. They gave people a way to carry grief without being crushed by it. They turned loss into purpose. They turned shock into action. Men who had been unsure now felt pulled into the fight. Volunteers who had hesitated now felt angry. Families who had been afraid now felt that fear had already arrived, and it would not leave unless something changed. The Alamo became proof that the conflict was not a small argument that could be settled icily. It was real war. It was blood and smoke. It was a battle that could reach any town, so people started preparing. They started choosing sides with more seriousness. They started seeing the Texas Revolution not as distant politics, but as a personal storm. Texian leaders also learned something hard from the Alamo. They learned that courage alone is not enough. A strong position can still fall if it is isolated. A brave stand can still end in tragedy if help does not arrive in time. That lesson would shape the choices made in the days ahead It would shape where men gathered, how they moved, how they fought, because the next battles would not be about holding a single set of walls. They would be about timing, speed, and survival. Santa Anna believed he had made an example. In one way. He had, but he made an example in the wrong direction. He believed the Alamo would scare the rebellion into silence. Instead, it gave the rebellion a story strong enough to pull more people in. It gave the Texians a memory that could march with them, and it gave them a sentence they could say when fear tried to stop them. Remember the Alamo. The Alamo, as a place, did not move. It stayed in San Antonio, quiet and damaged, but its story moved everywhere. It moved into camps where men trained. It moved into towns where families waited. It moved into the minds of leaders planning the next fight. And as the smoke from the Alamo faded into the sky, the bigger war did not fade with it. It grew. After the Alamo fell, Texas did not become quiet. It became louder in a different way, through panic, through rumors, through hurried footsteps on dirt roads. The news moved faster than people could prepare. It moved from town to town like a hard wind. Some heard it from riders. Some heard it from neighbors. Some heard it from a man who arrived shaking, with dust on his face and fear in his eyes. The Alamo is gone. Those words landed like a stone in the stomach. People in Texas understood what the fall meant. Santa Anna was not just winning battles. He was moving forward. And if he kept moving, he could reach more towns, more farms, more families. So the war stopped feeling far away. It started feeling personal, in homes and small settlements. Families began making choices with trembling hands. They packed what they could carry: blankets, food, tools, a few personal items, sometimes only a Bible or a small photograph. They left behind furniture, livestock, and the life they had built, because those things could be replaced. A life cannot. Mothers tied children's shoes quickly. Fathers checked rifles they hoped they would never have to use. Older people stared at the road as if it was an enemy, and then they began to move. This mass flight became known as the runaway scrape. It was not a single road or a single group. It was thousands of people pushing eastward, trying to stay ahead of an army that felt like a storm. Some families traveled in wagons. Some walked. Some rode horses. Many carried children on their hips or shoulders. The weather did not help. Roads became mud. Rivers rose. Cold nights hit hard. People did not flee in a neat line. They fled in fear, and fear is messy. At river crossings, the panic was visible. Wagons lined up. Animals cried out. People argued about who should go first, then apologized when they realized everyone was terrified. This was not cowardice. This was survival. Because when a war changes from soldiers fighting to armies moving through communities, civilians become targets simply by being in the way. And in those days, rumors made it worse. Some rumors were true. Some were not. But fear does not stop to check facts before it runs. While families fled, Texian leaders faced a different pressure. They could not win the war by hiding. They had to build an army strong enough to fight back. One key figure in this moment was Sam Houston. Houston carried responsibility like a heavy coat. He had to gather men, train them, and keep them alive long enough to face Santa Anna at the right time. That meant he had to make choices that many people hated, because sometimes the smartest move in war looks like weakness. Houston pulled his forces back at times. He avoided a big fight before his army was ready. Too many people watching. It looked like retreat. It looked like running. But Houston understood something important. If he fought too early, his army could be destroyed. And if his army was destroyed, there would be no one left to protect the fleeing families, and no one left to hold Texas together. So he delayed. He moved, he trained, and every day he waited. Pressure grew. Men in his camp wanted to fight. Civilians wanted protection. Politicians wanted results. And Santa Anna kept moving. In the Texian camps, the mood was sharp. Some men were angry. Some were frightened. Some were both. They had heard about the Alamo. They pictured what happened inside those walls. They imagined their own last moments and tried to push the thought away. The phrase "remember the Alamo" started to spread, but it was not a cheerful phrase. It was a hard one. It carried grief. It carried anger. It carried the feeling that something had to be answered. But even as that phrase grew, another tragedy struck Texas like a second hammer. Word came of another loss, another terrible moment in the revolution. Goliad. Again, the details traveled as a dark story. Texian prisoners killed after surrender. Again, fear spread. Again, anger rose. Now, the phrase changed shape. It became not only remember the Alamo, but also remember Goliad. 2 wounds, 1 fire. The combined effect of these events was powerful. For many, the war was no longer about arguments and politics. It became a fight about survival, justice, and revenge. Men who had hesitated now felt pulled into service. Men who had wanted to stay home now felt that home was not safe. The revolution began to fill with people who carried personal pain, and personal pain can be dangerous. It can make a person brave. It can also make a person reckless. So Houston had to balance 2 forces at the same time. He needed the men's anger, but he could not let anger control the plan. In training, soldiers learned to move as one unit. They learned when to fire, when to hold, when to charge. Many were not professional fighters. They were volunteers, farmers, workers, young men chasing an idea. Now they were becoming an army under pressure. Outside their camp, the runaway scrape continued. Families kept moving. Homes emptied. Fields were left behind. Livestock wandered. Texas felt like it was breaking apart. But in that breaking, something else was also forming. A stronger will, a sharper identity. The Alamo had become a memory that could march. The fleeing families became a reason to fight. The fear became a fuel. For civilians, the road was not heroic. It was exhausting. Children cried at night. Parents pretended everything would be okay. Some people got sick. Some lost belongings in mud. Some lost loved ones to the chaos of travel. And still they moved, because behind them was the image of an army. And behind that image was the smoke of the Alamo. Music begins to rise slowly. As days passed, a strange change began to happen. Fear did not disappear, but it started to mix with determination. People stopped saying only, "We must escape." They started saying, "When will we fight back?" That question moved through camps like electricity. It moved into Houston's plans. It moved into the hearts of men who were ready to stop running, and in the distance still, coming was the moment when Houston would finally choose the ground and say, "Here." By the time April came, Texas felt tired from fear. Families had been moving for weeks. Wagons had rolled through mud. Children had cried in the dark. Towns had emptied. Roads had filled with people who carried their whole lives in their arms. And behind all of that was one hard thought. If the Texian army did not stop Santa Anna soon, there would be nowhere left to run. Sam Houston carried that truth every day. He kept pulling his army back, even when men complained. Some called him weak. Some called him scared. But Houston was not simply running. He was waiting for the moment that could change everything. He needed the right ground, he needed the right time, and he needed Santa Anna to make a mistake. Houston's army was not perfect. Many men were volunteers. Some had little training. Some were angry and wanted revenge. Some were frightened but tried not to show it. They did not have endless supplies. They did not have endless time, but they had something powerful. They had a reason. They had families running. On the roads behind them, they had the memory of the Alamo. They had the pain of Goliad. Those 2 names had become a fire that stayed lit in the chest. Sound, low drumbeat returns. Then, the situation shifted. Santa Anna had been moving fast. He wanted to end the revolution quickly. He wanted to catch the Texian leaders, crush their army, and force Texas back under control. Speed gave him confidence, but speed can also create gaps. The Mexican forces were not always together as one strong fist. Units spread out. Messages took time. Camps had to be built. Food had to be found. Soldiers had to rest. And the more Santa Anna pushed, the more chances he gave his enemy. Near the San Jacinto area, Santa Anna set up a camp. The ground had open spaces and nearby water. It looked like a place to pause and prepare. But a pause is dangerous when the opponent is watching. Houston's army arrived close enough to feel the enemy's presence. They could see movement. They could sense the closeness of decision. This was it. The running could not continue forever. Soon, the fighting would decide the story. In Houston's camp, tension rose like heat. Men wanted to attack. They wanted to stop the fear. They wanted to answer the Alamo. Some also wanted to prove something to themselves, to the world, to history. But Houston still held them back at first. He studied, he waited, he watched Santa Anna's camp patterns. He looked for weakness. A strong leader does not only feel anger, he controls it. He must. Because anger can make people rush into a trap. As the day moved forward, the Texian soldiers grew restless. They were close enough to fight. They could almost taste it. Every hour of waiting felt like being held underwater. But then the moment finally came. Houston chose to strike. Not at dawn. Not when the enemy was fully alert, but when the day had worn on and the enemy camp believed it had time. The Texian line formed quietly. Men moved into position with serious faces. Some were shaking. Some were calm. Most were both. They did not look like a perfect army from a storybook. They looked like real people pushed to the edge. Houston rode along the line. He did not promise an easy win. He did not pretend there would be no blood. He gave them something simpler. A clear instruction. A clear moment. A clear purpose. Then the order came, and the Texian soldiers surged forward. The attack hit the Mexican camp like a sudden wave. It was fast. It was loud. It was violent. The air filled with shouting and gunfire. Smoke rose quickly. Horses screamed. Men stumbled out of tents, confused and half-ready. Surprise changes everything in war. In one moment, an army can feel strong, and the next, it can feel blind. Texian soldiers shouted words that had been building for weeks. Remember the Alamo. Remember Goliad. Those were not just slogans. They were grief turned into motion. The fighting was intense and short. The Texian attack did not give the Mexican camp time to fully organize. Panic mixed with resistance. Some Mexican soldiers fought hard. Others tried to regroup. Others tried to run. The sound was constant shots, screams, commands, and chaos. That the battle did not drag out for hours. It ended quickly, like a door slamming. And when it ended, the field belonged to Houston's army. For the Texians, it felt like a release, like breathing after weeks of holding breath, like the earth finally stopping its shaking. But one thing still mattered. Santa Anna. He had started this push with confidence. Now he was in danger. And in war, when the leader falls, the story can flip in a single day. After the battle, Santa Anna escaped the camp area. He tried to hide, blending into the chaos. He moved like a man who understood that power means nothing if you were caught. But the next day, Texian soldiers found him. Some accounts described him captured while hiding and recognized, because of his status and the reaction of prisoners. However it happened in the exact details, the outcome was real. Santa Anna was captured. His capture was not just the capture of a person, it was the capture of leverage. Because now, Houston and the Texian leadership had something they did not have before, a way to force an ending. Santa Anna, under pressure, gave orders that led to Mexican forces pulling back. And soon after, agreements were made that supported Texas moving toward independence. The war did not become simple overnight. History rarely does, but San Jacinto was the turning point. It was the moment the fear stopped owning the road. It was the moment Texas stopped being chased and became the one chasing. For the people who had been running families on muddy roads, San Jacinto meant hope could return. Maybe not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to stop the panic from swallowing everything. And for the men who had shouted, "Remember the Alamo," San Jacinto meant the sacrifice had not vanished into silence. The Alamo was still a loss, but now it had an answer. Today, the Alamo looks quiet. The stone is pale in the sun. Visitors stand close, reading signs, taking photos, and lowering their voices without being told. Even people who arrive with excitement often leave with a calmer face, because the Alamo does something to the human mind. It reminds people that history is not only dates and names. History is fear, choice, and the cost of standing still when the world is moving around you. Pause After San Jacinto, Texas began moving into a new chapter. The fighting did not erase the pain. It did not bring back the men who died in the Alamo, but it did shift the direction of the story. For many Texians, the Alamo became a proof of sacrifice. It became a reason to believe that their struggle meant something. It became a piece of identity. But a symbol is never simple. A symbol is shaped by memory, and memory is shaped by the stories people choose to repeat. As years passed, people told and retold the Alamo story. Some told it like a warning, some told it like a heroic song, some told it like a tragedy. Many told it like all three at the same time. Over time, the Alamo turned into more than a battlefield. It turned into a legend, and legends grow in a special way. They keep the strong emotions. They smooth out the messy details. They turn complex people into simple heroes or simple villains. But real history is rarely that clean. Pause, the music becomes thoughtful. The truth is that the Alamo was not a perfect plan. The defenders were brave, but bravery does not always equal good strategy. Some people have argued that holding the Alamo was necessary. Others have argued it was a mistake that cost lives. And because records from the time are limited and sometimes conflicting, not every detail can be proven with full certainty. Even the final moments of famous figures have been debated over the years. Different accounts describe different endings. Some stories grew larger as they were passed along. That does not mean the story is fake. It means the story is human. When something is painful and important, people try to make it meaningful. They try to shape it into something that fits the heart. Cut 2. A close-up of a name engraved on a memorial. What can be said with confidence is this. The battle happened. The siege lasted nearly 2 weeks. The assault was fast and deadly. The defenders were overwhelmed, and the fall of the Alamo helped create a rallying cry that pushed more people toward the Texian cause. Those facts form the spine of the story, but the feelings around those facts are what made the Alamo immortal. In the years that followed, the Alamo's meaning shifted depending on who was speaking. For many Texans, it became a symbol of courage against impossible odds. For others, it became a reminder of how politics can lead ordinary people into extreme violence. For historians, it became a subject of study, one that demands careful thinking, not only pride. And for visitors today, it often becomes something personal, because when someone stands in front of an old wall and thinks, "People died here," the mind does not stay neutral. A child visiting the Alamo might not understand the Texas Revolution, but the child can feel the mood of the adults. The child can sense that this place matters. That is how history survives, not only in books, but in the way people behave when they enter a space where the past is still heavy. Music softens. The Alamo also teaches a harder lesson. A defeat can have power. In war, people often chase only victory, but sometimes a defeat becomes a spark that spreads farther than a win ever could. The Alamo did not win the battle, but it helped shape the will that won later, and that is why people remember it, not because it was simple, but because it was intense, because it forced a choice, because it showed what happens when people decide to stand, even when the odds feel cruel. Still, there is another important truth. The Alamo is not only about famous names. It was also about the many men whose names are not spoken as often. Men who were not born, famous men who did not plan to become legends, men who stepped into a moment bigger than themselves and were swallowed by it. A real biography should not forget them, because history is made by crowds, not only by stars. So what is the Alamo, really? It is a mission turned into a fort. It is a fort turned into a battlefield. It is a battlefield turned into a symbol. And it is a symbol that still lives, because it touches something inside people. The fear of being surrounded, the hope for help that may never arrive, the stubborn decision to hold on anyway. In the end, the Alamo's story is not asking people to love war. It is asking people to face what war does. It shows how quickly life can change, how fast a place can turn from ordinary to historic, how fear can move whole, families across a landscape, and how memory can outlive stone. The Alamo is still standing, not as a fort, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that real people once stood behind these walls and made choices under extreme pressure. Some choices were brave, some choices were flawed, all choices were human, and now the story passes to the present, to the people who visit, to the people who study, to the people who argue about what it means, because the final chapter of the Alamo is not written only by the past, that it is written by what people do with the memory. If the viewer wants to go deeper, the next step is simple. Keep watching, because the Alamo has two stories, the one people repeat, and the one history can prove. In the next video, the viewer will see the biggest myths, the biggest misunderstandings, and the most surprising facts that change how this story feels.